Along the wet green edges of the southern Louisiana bayous, in the smothering summer of 1872, 11 men died in their beds. No fever took them, no wasting cough. Their throats were opened with a steadiness that suggested practice, and their faces, left unguarded by sleep, froze between rapture and dread. By sunrise, the bodies were counted: merchants, planters, lawyers, pillars. People called them, each a sworn brother of the Knights of the White Camellia, that cultivated cousin to the hooded terror that strutted elsewhere. The parish papers filed these deaths under coincidence, then under rumor, then under nothing at all. Reports contradicted witnesses, evidence contradicted reports, and, after 6 months of baffled officialdom, a parish judge sealed it all away like a family disgrace. But in the cramped wood-frame rooms behind the church where the freed people prayed, and in kitchens that smelled of lye soap and chicory, another account was kept, passed breath to ear, cradle to lap like psalms too dangerous for hymnals. It began not in 1872, but 4 years earlier, when the smoke of war had thinned, yet refused to lift. St. Martin Parish in 1868 was a wound that would not close. Cane fields curled back into swamp. Columns that once pretended to Grecian calm leaned like drunkards. A courthouse changed flags the way a gambler changes seats. And in the street, this was the part the old families could not swallow. Nearly 4,000 people once bought and sold like plows, now walked in their own names. Some owned a scrap of land. Some voted. Some stood up in court and spoke truth in rooms designed to never hear their voices. The order that had seemed to the planters as fixed as astronomy came loose, and the men who believed themselves its custodians gathered to pin it back into place with tidy brutality. No bedsheets, no burning crosses. The Louisiana Knights favored soft hands and iron rules. They were sheriffs and judges and men who knew how to write a denial that sounded like common sense. A creditor's string here, a field torched there, a warning at midnight from gentlemen who smiled when they threatened you. Violence, when it came, was the last instrument in a well-tuned orchestra. Into that parlor of quiet menace stepped a woman who called herself Celeste Dufresne. She arrived one Tuesday on a steamboat out of New Orleans with a single trunk and a parasol black as spilled ink. 30, perhaps younger. Grief makes faces older. Purpose smooths them again. Her French flowed like a well-oiled hinge. Her English wore a Paris coat. Creole, people guessed. Or French, or both. A widow of means, she said. The fever had emptied her home, and she wished to live where the air moved. She took a room at Jessup's Hotel and paid a month in gold. She went to Mass on Sundays and sat where old families sat. She ate alone in the dining room, turning the pages of French novels without looking at anyone long enough to embarrass them. In the afternoon, she walked with her parasol angled just so, neither seeking company nor shrinking from it. If she noticed the way the parish's gaze collected on her like midges on water, she gave no sign. A month later, 11 men in Thursday coats felt that her name crowded their mouths when they spoke of anything else. It began with a kindness, or the performance of one. Thomas Broussard, who had inherited fields of cotton and the righteous little cruelties that came with them, found her considering muslin at the general store and offered to broker a fair price. Her smile felt like a compliment he hadn't earned. She worried aloud about finding a house. He recommended parcels. She thanked him with a hand at his sleeve that lingered a breath longer than necessary. That was all. But he was still thinking about her when the candles were snuffed that night. About the lavender that followed her like a thought. About the way, when she listened, the rest of the world leaned back. The others made her acquaintance as men do when they have dressed self-interest in chivalry. A lawyer offered to look over deeds. The parish coroner tutted about the nerves of a widow, his palm already itching to prescribe. The banker hinted at favorable terms. The shopkeeper extended credit. She received each with the same dignified economy, never eager, never cold, as if accepting the rain in a place that rains daily. Each man went home warmed by the belief that she had granted him an intimacy he had not been offered by his wife in years. The illusion of being necessary. By June, their Thursday meetings soured with something they did not name. Rivalry sprouted like mold under the floorboards. They smoothed their waistcoats and mentioned, casually, that they had shown Madame Dufresne a property, reviewed a contract, recommended a physician. None of them noticed that weeks passed and she bought nothing. None of them asked what it meant for a grieving woman to be so composed, so deliberate, so perfectly ordinary. At night, in room 7, Celeste opened a leather-bound book and set down what she had learned in a hand as neat as stitches, where each man lived and who slept where, which dogs barked and which could be coaxed with meat, whether their wives took drafts for sleep, how many locks on a back door, what a man did with his hands when he lied. She kept other lists too, older ones, copied and recopied until the names felt carved. Men whipped for trying to vote, cabins burned for daring to trade at a black-owned store, a farmer foreclosed upon because the bank did not lend to his kind, a woman in Baton Rouge whose husband's death certificate told a polite lie. Celeste Dufresne, if that was her name, had come not to buy land. She had come for balance. Broussard died first, on a July dawn so hot the curtains sweated. His wife found him. The cut was almost loving, so deep it was nearly decapitation, but the slack of his mouth looked like a man exhaling at last. 2 glasses on the bedside table. The floral ghost of lavender. Bedclothes that whispered of the fact decent people didn't name. Esther, who had served the house when service was a euphemism, found the long dark hair caught in a floorboard and burned the sheets without telling the sheriff what else they told her. In kitchens where it was safe to speak, the women said the thing that would never enter an affidavit. He had not died alone. He had not died unpleasured. He had died as he had lived, believing himself untouchable. 3 weeks later, the lawyer bled out in his rooms above Main Street, the same practiced hand, the same soft stillness after. By then the whispers had gathered a name for her. L'Ave Noire, the Black Widow. A name not of color only, but of habit and patience, of a center and its web. The coroner followed in August, laid carefully upon his own examination table, a note pinned over his heart in a script that could have been taught by nuns. Remember Baton Rouge. 4 years earlier he had called a wound natural causes, so that killers could go free. 4 years earlier a girl had watched the law shrug. It was Judge Teo who said what pride would not let the others say. The killer must be someone they knew, someone invited past thresholds. They thought it. They tasted it. They gagged on it. A woman. That was when the investigation turned inward and then, immediately, away. How to arrest shame without arresting one's own appetites. How to testify without bruising one's reputation on the stand. Even as fear hardened in their throats, fascination tugged like a hooked thread. Men who had ordered torches into cabins found themselves sitting very straight when she entered a room. They sent inquiries to New Orleans for a dead Monsieur Dufresne and received silence back. The boarding house she'd named housed a washerwoman and 2 clerks and never a widow with black silk. The hotel girl, Rachel, said Madame's room smelled of lavender even when she wasn't there, and that a leather case, plain, clean, heavy, came and went at scandalous hours. Everyone tightened their doors and hired guards who had once carried sabers. They varied their habits, counting days like rosary beads, and yet the shopkeeper died with his horse still cropping roadside grass, and the banker bled across the face of his accounts. Each carried its own quiet footnote. Remember the store you burned. Remember the farmer you crushed and called it policy. By then a federal marshal had come and gone, stern and careful, and he, too, learned what towns learn to say when the law's questions threaten to knock loose the little order they still own. There is a woman, he was told. She is everyone and no one. She knows our dead by their Christian names. If you are looking for one killer, you misunderstand the load of justice. It takes a parish to carry that weight. The men who remained, Jessup with his polished hotel manners, Thibodeau with his sour editorials, Judge Teo with his half-digested scriptures, Sheriff Devereaux with his habit for power, met in a jail cell because it felt defensible. Devereaux found a pattern on his calendar, 2 weeks between each death, as precise as a clock wound by a careful hand. They would fort up in the courthouse, he said. Thick walls and few doors. Guards posted. Provisions for days. They would do what men of their class had always done when the world threatened to spill over the top of the china. Raise the rims and pretend the water had calmed. But the courthouse had a throat nobody consulted. The coal chute added in 67. A practical shaft that lived outside the imagination of men who did not dirty their hands with coal. The grate came up with bolts already loosened, and a woman dressed for work rather than mourning slid down into the dark and waited for her eyes to learn the shape of it. She moved where the boards did not betray her, where cleaners had told her the floor would keep her secrets. She listened to men invent the future in voices that carried more liquor than sense. When she stepped through the clerk's door into the courtroom, she might have been any shadow. the faintest lavender on the heat. Pistols lifted, courage wobbled. She spoke in a voice without bristle. "My name is Josephine Boudreau," she said. "My mother was Sarah. My father was Marcus. You murdered them in 1868. I have come for what is owed." There was a long, strange quiet, as if the building itself had turned its head to hear. "Arrest her," the judge ordered. But the guards hesitated, sensing perhaps that she was only the visible part of a larger thing, the sharpened tip of a town's grief. "You can shoot me," Josephine said. "Hang me. Bury me under your courthouse lawn. But my walking out alive is not the only measure of this night. Every door in the quarters knows you are here. If I do not give the sign that all is well, if your guns speak before your consciences do, the story will go to Baton Rouge, then to New Orleans, then north along the river, and you will spend the rest of your days answering questions you cannot manage with a wink." "What do you want?" Devereaux asked, history suddenly too heavy for his belt. "What the law denied," she said. "If you will not provide justice, you will accept its shadow. Balance." She told their lives back to them, ledgered in a careful hand. Dates and names, bodies and flames, threats dressed in courtesy. Not the euphemisms, but the deeds. The judge tried to call it a confession. She offered him a trial. "Summon the freedmen you disqualified. Subpoena the women you called liars. Put me on the stand, and I will say this again with your stenographer catching every word." He understood then that a fair trial would be the scaffold they feared more than rope. Outside, voices rose, hymns braided to courage, not a mob. A witness, lanterns bobbing like constellations pulled close to earth. A sound born in fields and cabins that had outlived their owners, risen again in new throats. It did not threaten, not exactly, it insisted. Judge Théot laughed once and sounded older by 10 years. "We spent these years arranging the world to suit us," he said. "Now the bill is laid on the table." In the pitiless lamp glow, Josephine took a folded photograph from her bag and smoothed its creases with her thumb. A young woman looked out at her, eyes as direct as a scrap of light, taken in 1866, when hope was still a thing you could point to. She returned it to her bag and set 4 notes on the bench, the last of her small, inexorable liturgies. No one fired. No one rushed her. Dawn came on like a reprieve nobody trusted. She walked out under those hymns. The crowd parted as if she were a bride. The guards watched her pass and discovered that nothing in their training had prepared them to stop a story leaving a building. What happened after never made an honest record. The courthouse kept its confessions in a drawer only some hands were permitted to open. The judge left the bench and found bottom in a glass elsewhere. The sheriff discovered that elections can be lost. The hotel closed, and its owner learned that a lobby without guests is only a room with too many chairs. The newspaper resumed. Its printing, but not its power. Words can sour when the town knows what they cost. The night's fine talk rotted, and with it the habit of deciding after dark what other people would be allowed to do in daylight. Josephine disappeared along the rail lines the way a thought disappears into a book once it's taught you what you needed. Some said Mexico. Some said Canada's clean cold. She went to New York instead and worked in rooms that smelled of ink and coal heat, drafting letters to congressmen who did not always answer, putting names on petitions, teaching women how not to sign with an X. She never wrote her story. She never turned it into the currency of applause. She died in 1903 at 47, which is not old enough for a life that hard, and the stone over her was plain. In St. Martin Parish, the legend kept its breath. Children learned it in kitchens, not classrooms. Old women told it in the pauses between shelling peas and folding sheets. A woman who walked into the teeth of what had eaten her life and fed it her knife instead. The tale changed in its ornaments the way all good tales do, but not in its spine. The spine was this: there are debts the law will not collect, and songs the law will not sing, and when the tally gets long enough, somebody brave or broken or both will take it upon herself to even the page. Could it have happened exactly this way? Perhaps not exactly. Paper refuses what memory carries easily. But the summer heat was real, and the lavender was real, and the 12-year-old girl in Baton Rouge learned something real about what justice means when men in coats say it too softly. She grew up inside that lesson. She studied the habits of wolves and the places fences sag. She chose the instrument at hand, beauty, patience, a knife, a town's quiet complicity, and she made a music that the men who felt themselves conductors could not silence. If there is an answer to whether revenge equals justice, it is not the kind of answer that leaves you comfortable. Justice wants daylight and signatures and a seal pressed into wax. Revenge works at night and leaves notes. Between them lies the country we live in, imperfect and human, where some crimes rot documents and some truths refuse to be notarized. Josephine stood in that space and said the names of the dead until the living could not pretend not to hear. The bayou has a way of keeping what it's given. Stand close to the water on a windless evening and you will hear frogs and insects, and beneath them a low murmuring like a congregation's breath between verses. If you listen long enough, if you know what the old people taught you to tune your ear for, you may catch the sound of a parasol clicking shut, of a latch lifted in a careful house, of a woman smoothing the crease in a photograph and stepping forward because there was no one else left who would.